The night sky over Chicago burned red. Sirens wailed down the empty street as neighbors gathered in their coats and boots, the bitter wind slicing through them. They whispered to one another, heads shaking, eyes darting toward the young man standing alone at the edge of the lawn. Ethan Reed didn't flinch. The flames devoured everything he had ever called home, licking the roof beams until they collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Smoke rolled upward into the dark like some furious, hungry spirit. Firefighters shouted orders, boots slamming against frozen asphalt. But Ethan only watched with the hollow stillness of someone whose soul had already burned to ash long before the fire reached the walls. He could hear fragments of what the neighbors said. "Is that Pastor Daniel's house? God help them. Where is the family? Wasn't the son inside?" Their voices twisted together like the wind around him. But Ethan kept his gaze locked on the flames. His face showed nothing, not grief, not fear, not guilt, only emptiness. A police officer approached carefully. "Son," the man said, breath visible in the cold. "You need to come with me. Do you live here?" Ethan turned his head slowly. "Used to," he said softly. The officer's eyes searched his expression for something. Shock, panic, sorrow. He found nothing. Anyone inside when the fire started? Ethan looked back at the flames. They roared as if answering for him. "My dad," he said finally. "Pastor Daniel." His voice cracked on the name, though whether from emotion or the biting air, no one could tell. The officer motioned toward the paramedics. "Let's get you checked out." Ethan didn't move. Instead, he whispered to himself, so low no one else could hear. This was always how it had to end. Hours earlier, the house had been quiet. He remembered the sound of his father's voice carrying down the hallway, reading scripture in that calm, commanding tone the whole congregation admired. Pastor Daniel Reed, respected, righteous, untouchable, the man who built the Circle of Light Church from nothing, the man who told his flock he spoke with God himself, the man who raised Ethan, the man who lied. Ethan closed his eyes now against the smoke, but memories kept slicing through like shards of glass. His father's hand gripping his shoulder after Sunday sermons, the heavy Bible slammed on the kitchen table during arguments, the locked study door Ethan wasn't allowed to open. And beneath it all, his mother's silence. Margaret Reed, the faithful wife, always obedient. "Always watching," a firefighter shouted from the burning doorway. "We've got someone." Ethan's head snapped toward the voice as two men dragged a limp figure out into the cold. The heat shimmered around them. The man's face was blackened with soot, clothes burned away in strips. Pastor Daniel. Paramedics swarmed him, shouting words Ethan couldn't hear over the pounding in his ears. Oxygen mask, heart rate, possible burns over 60%. Someone grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him back from the chaos. "Son, you need to stay here," the officer said firmly. But Ethan barely felt the man's grip. His eyes stayed on his father's broken body lying in the snow. For 21 years, Daniel Reed had been untouchable, a man people called a prophet, a leader, a man of God. And now he looked so small, so mortal. The wind shifted, carrying smoke and ash over the lawn. Flakes of burnt wood and paper drifted down like black snow. One landed on Ethan's sleeve. He brushed it away and watched it crumble between his fingers. Somewhere inside him, something cracked open, because he knew this wasn't just fire. This was truth finally ripping its way to the surface. The secrets, the lies, the things his father never wanted the world, or Ethan, to know. And as the ambulance doors slammed shut on Pastor Daniel Reed, Ethan felt the weight of everything about to come. The fire still burned behind him as the sirens carried his father away. And for the first time, Ethan turned his back on the house. The past was gone now. But the story of how it all began, that would come next. Morning sunlight spilled across the frozen lawn, painting the house in gold as if the night before had never happened. But this was weeks earlier, before the fire, before everything turned to ash. Ethan Reed sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a chipped mug of coffee, watching his father at the stove. Pastor Daniel always cooked Sunday breakfasts after sermons, eggs, bacon, pancakes stacked like towers. It was tradition, one of many the family kept like commandments. His mother, Margaret, moved quietly between them, setting plates, refilling juice, never quite looking anyone in the eye. Ethan had grown up believing this was what families were supposed to be. Neat, loving, unshakable. But lately, something in him had started to question it. "Big day ahead, son," Pastor Daniel said, sliding a plate of eggs onto the table. His voice carried that warm authority people trusted instantly, the same voice that filled pews every Sunday. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, guess so." "You'll help with the youth service tonight?" "Sure," Ethan said, though his mind was far away, because last night he had found it. The letter. It had been slipped under his door while he slept. A single envelope with his name scrawled across it in sharp, hurried handwriting. Inside, one line written in black ink. "Your father is lying to you. Ask about where you really come from. No name, no explanation." Ethan had read it 3 times before folding it back up and hiding it in his desk drawer. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. At breakfast, Pastor Daniel talked about the upcoming revival service, about faith, about building a bigger church in the city. He spoke with the passion of a man on a mission, a man who believed God himself took notes when he talked. Ethan only half listened. Because now, every word felt like theatre. Later that day, Ethan stood in the church doorway, watching his father preach. Rows of people leaned forward in the pews, drinking in every syllable. Pastor Daniel's voice boomed through the sanctuary. "We are chosen," he thundered. "We walk in the light because the darkness cannot touch us." Applause filled the room. Ethan's mother sat in the front row, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes shining with admiration. She always looked at Daniel that way, as if he weren't just her husband, but a man sent from heaven itself. But Ethan? He couldn't stop hearing the words from that letter. Ask about where you really come from. After the service, as people hugged and shook hands, Ethan found himself beside his mother in the hallway. "Good sermon," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "Your father was born for this." "Yeah," Ethan said. Then after a pause, "Mom, can I ask you something?" She looked at him properly for the first time all day. "Of course. Was there ever anything about me Dad didn't tell me? About my birth?" The question froze her mid-step. It was only a flicker, barely a second. But he saw it, a shadow crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "No, Ethan," she said finally. "Nothing like that." Her voice was calm, too calm, and for the first time, Ethan felt certain she was lying. That night, he sat alone in his room, the letter open on his desk again. The words seemed darker now, heavier. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying faint echoes from the church down the street. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The church always felt different at night. Ethan walked through the empty sanctuary, his footsteps echoing across the polished floorboards. Stained glass windows threw fractured moonlight onto the pews, bathing the place in eerie blues and reds. He wasn't supposed to be here, not after hours. But lately, rules didn't matter much to him. The youth service had ended hours ago, the last group of teenagers leaving with laughter and half-eaten slices of pizza. Pastor Daniel had given one of his booming speeches about purity and devotion before retreating to his study upstairs, locking the door behind him like always. Ethan had lingered behind, pretending to clean up while his real reasons simmered under the surface. The letter still burned in his mind. His mother's too calm denial echoed in his ears, and underneath it all something new, anger. Tonight, he wanted answers. The first crack appeared when he saw Caleb. Caleb Monroe wasn't much older than Ethan, maybe 24, but he carried himself like someone who owned every hallway he walked through. His role in the circle of light was simple: security, which really meant keeping people out of places they weren't supposed to go. Ethan froze when Caleb appeared at the far end of the corridor, leaning casually against the wall. "You're here late," Caleb said, voice smooth but laced with something sharp. Ethan shrugged. "Just cleaning up." Caleb's eyes lingered on him, cold and assessing. "Your dad doesn't like people wandering around after hours." The way he said it made it sound less like advice and more like a warning. "I'm not wandering," Ethan said. "Just heading out." Caleb smirked slightly but didn't move. "Good. Wouldn't want you to see anything you shouldn't." Something in Ethan's chest tightened, but he kept walking. Calm on the outside, even as his thoughts spiraled. Outside, the wind bit at his face. Across the parking lot, the church's second building, the one reserved for administrative purposes, sat dark and silent. His father's study was in there. And tonight, for the first time, Ethan wondered what exactly his father kept behind that locked door. Later, in the kitchen, Margaret stood at the sink washing dishes. Her back was rigid, shoulders tight. "Mom," Ethan said, leaning against the counter. "What's with Caleb? He's always around after hours." She didn't turn around. "He helps your father. With what?" Margaret hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Church matters," she said finally. Ethan stared at her. "Why does it feel like there's stuff here I'm not supposed to see?" She turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was exhaustion in her face, like someone holding up a mask for too long. "Ethan," she said softly, "sometimes faith requires trust." He waited for her to say more. She didn't. That night, Ethan lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake Caleb's words. "Wouldn't want you to see anything you shouldn't. The church, his family, the rules." Suddenly it all felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong question. And somewhere deep down, he knew there were things waiting to be uncovered, things his father didn't want him to find. Outside his window, the church lights flickered once before going out, the whole place sinking into darkness. Tomorrow, he decided he would start looking, because the perfect family lie was beginning to crack, and Ethan Reed wanted to know what was hiding behind it. The church was empty when Ethan slipped. Back inside the next evening, snow fell silently outside, dusting the parking lot in white. Inside, the building smelled faintly of old wood and candle wax, shadows stretching long across the hallways. His father was away at a prayer retreat with several elders. Margaret was home preparing for Sunday services. For the first time in his life, Ethan had the run of the place, and he intended to use it. The door to Pastor Daniel's office stood at the end of the corridor like a sealed vault. Ethan reached into his pocket for the key he'd borrowed from his mother's ring while she cooked dinner. His pulse thundered in his ears as he slid the metal into the lock. One slow turn. A faint click. The door creaked open. Inside, the office smelled of dust and leather. A large wooden desk dominated the center of the room, its surface stacked with Bibles, sermon notes, and folders labeled with the church's insignia. A sunburst wrapped in a circle of thorns. Ethan's eyes swept the room. Filing cabinets lined the walls, drawers locked tight. He moved quickly, searching the desk first, rifling through papers, financial reports, donation lists, volunteer rosters, all ordinary. Then he found the cabinet key in the top drawer. The second cabinet opened with a metallic snap. Inside were folders arranged alphabetically, each one stamped Circle of Light, confidential. He scanned labels until his own name stopped him cold. Reed, Ethan James. His fingers trembled as he pulled the folder free. Birth certificate, baptismal record, medical forms, but something was wrong. The birth certificate listed Margaret Reed as his mother, but under father, it didn't say Daniel. It said Michael Hartman. Ethan stared at the name until the letters blurred. He flipped through the pages faster now, heart pounding, breath coming hard. At the back of the folder, stapled to the medical records, was a single photograph. A woman with dark hair stood smiling in the sunlight, a baby cradled in her arms. Someone had written a name on the back in faded ink. Claire. The edges of the photo were worn, as if someone had handled it too many times before hiding it away. Behind him, the door creaked. Ethan froze. He turned slowly to find Caleb leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You're not supposed to be in here," Caleb said. Ethan's mind raced. He stuffed the folder back into the cabinet, slamming the drawer shut. "I was just looking for something." Caleb's tone was mild, but there was steel beneath it. Ethan swallowed. "Church stuff. Dad asked me to." "Don't lie," Caleb said softly. The two stared at each other, the silence thick as smoke. Finally, Caleb stepped back into the hallway. "Lock the door when you're done." Then he walked away. Ethan stood frozen for a long moment before grabbing the photo of Claire and shoving it into his jacket. He didn't care about the folder anymore, because tonight, everything had changed. Michael Hartman, Claire, names his father had never spoken, names tied to his birth. Outside, snow kept falling, the world quiet and cold. Ethan walked home through the darkness, the photo burning like a secret in his pocket. Tomorrow, he would ask his mother about the woman in the picture, and he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer. The kitchen smelled of onions and garlic when Ethan walked in. Margaret. Reed stood at the counter chopping vegetables. The rhythmic thunk-thunk of the knife the only sound in the room. Warm light spilled from the ceiling lamp, making everything feel deceptively ordinary. Ethan shut the door behind him, the photo heavy in his jacket pocket. For a moment, he just watched her work. The woman who had raised him, kissed his bruises when he fell off his bike, prayed beside his bed at night. The woman who had smiled at his graduation, wept when he left for college. The woman who might have lied about everything. "Mom," Ethan said finally. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You're home early. Did you eat?" "Not hungry," she nodded. Went back to chopping. Ethan pulled the photograph from his pocket and slid it onto the counter beside her cutting board. Margaret froze. The knife hovered mid-air. Her eyes flicked to the picture, then to Ethan. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "In Dad's office," Ethan said. His voice was steady, but his heart slammed against his ribs. "Who is she?" Margaret set the knife down slowly, wiped her hands on a towel. Then she picked up the photo. Her thumb brushed the faded corner as if she hadn't seen it in years. "She's—" Margaret started, then stopped. Her throat worked like the words were knives cutting their way out. "Tell me," Ethan said. Margaret's gaze stayed fixed on the picture. "Her name is Claire. Who is she to me?" Margaret flinched. Silence filled the kitchen like smoke. Finally, Margaret spoke, voice low. "She was someone we used to know." Ethan stared at her. "Someone you used to know?" He stepped closer. "The birth records list her name. Not yours, hers. And some man. Michael Hartman. So tell me the truth. Was I adopted? Stolen? What?" Margaret's hands trembled. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw fear in her eyes. "Your father will explain," she said finally. "I'm asking you," Ethan snapped. His voice cracked through the warm kitchen air like thunder. Margaret flinched again, clutching the towel in both hands. "There are things," she said slowly. "Things about your birth, about the church, that are complicated." "Complicated?" Ethan's laugh was sharp, bitter. "My whole life is a lie, and you call it complicated." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they glistened. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered, "so many times. But your father—" "Yeah," Ethan cut in. "Dad the prophet. Dad, the man of God. Dad, with his locked office, full of secrets." "Don't talk about him like that," Margaret snapped suddenly. The sharpness in her voice startled him, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same trembling silence. Margaret turned back to the counter, gripping the edge like she might fall if she let go. "You have to understand," she said softly. "When you were born, there were promises made. To the church, to God," Ethan repeated flatly. "Or to Dad." Margaret didn't answer. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling the kitchen window. Finally, Margaret set the photo back on the counter. "You should leave this alone, Ethan," she said. Her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. Some things can't be undone once you know them. But her eyes betrayed her words. Because behind the warning, there was guilt and fear. Ethan picked up the photograph again, sliding it back into his jacket. "I'm finding her," he said. Margaret's face drained of colour. "Don't," she whispered. But Ethan was already walking toward the door. Because now it wasn't just suspicion or anger driving him. It was the certainty that the woman in the photograph held answers his parents never would know. Whipped across the yard as he stepped outside. Tomorrow, he would start looking for Claire. And something deep in his gut told him the truth would burn worse than fire. Finding her name was the easy part. Ethan spent 3 nights hunched over his laptop, digging through old church records, newspaper archives, even Facebook profiles that hadn't been touched in years. Claire Hartman. The name glowed on his screen like a warning. She lived just outside the city now. A small apartment, above a hardware store in a neighborhood no one from the circle of light would ever visit. Ethan stared at the address for a long time before finally printing it out. He didn't tell Margaret where he was going. Snow fell in heavy sheets the night he drove across Chicago, his mother's voice echoing in his memory. Don't. But he needed answers. The apartment building looked tired. Paint peeling from the bricks, a buzzing street lamp flickering out front. Ethan climbed the stairs, heart hammering harder with each step, until he stood at her door. For a moment, he couldn't move. Then he knocked. The door opened slowly. Claire stood there. Older now, maybe 40, hair streaked with grey, but the resemblance hit him like a punch. The same dark eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. "Ethan," she said softly, as if she'd been expecting him. He froze. You know who I am?" Claire nodded, opening the door wider. "Come inside. You look like you've seen a ghost." Her apartment smelled of coffee and old books. A single lamp lit the small living room. She motioned for him to sit, then brought 2 steaming mugs from the kitchen. Ethan stayed standing. "Start talking," he said. Claire studied him for a moment. "You look so much like him." "Like who?" "Michael," she said. "Your real father." The words knocked the air from his lungs. "Michael Hartman," she continued. "He was my husband. Before the circle of light tore everything apart." Ethan gripped the back of a chair. "The church?" Claire's face hardened. "Your father, Daniel Reed, he wasn't always a pastor. Back then, he was just a man with big ideas and a talent for twisting scripture until people believed him. Michael and I joined early on. We thought it was faith, community, purpose." Her hands shook as she wrapped them around her mug. But Daniel, he wanted control, absolute control. And when Michael started questioning him, Daniel called it rebellion against God. Ethan felt his stomach twist. "What does that have to do with me?" Claire looked at him, eyes brimming. "I was pregnant. Michael and I wanted to leave the church before you were born, but Daniel wouldn't let us. He said children born into the circle belonged to God, and to him as God's prophet." The room tilted. Ethan gripped the chair harder. "You're saying—" Claire nodded. "He took you, Ethan, the day you were born, said I was unfit, that Michael had turned his back on the light. They told the congregation we left willingly, but the truth is, we were never allowed near you again." Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. "My whole life," he whispered. "Every memory, every sermon, it was all built on this lie?" Claire's face crumpled. "I tried to fight him, wrote letters, showed up at the church once when you were little. They threatened to call the police, said I was unstable. Daniel made everyone believe I was dangerous, that keeping you from me was protecting you." Ethan staggered back a step, chest tight, breath shallow. Claire reached for him, but he pulled away. "He baptized me," Ethan said, voice breaking. "Raised me like his son, like he was some holy man, and all that time." "He stole you," Claire said flatly. "From me, from Michael, from the life you were supposed to have." The words landed like hammer blows. Ethan sank onto the couch, hands over his face. A hollow sound escaped his throat. Part laugh, part sob. Because now the fire in his chest wasn't just anger. It was betrayal so deep, it scraped the bottom of his soul. "Where's Michael now?" he asked finally. Claire's eyes dropped to the floor. "He died 5 years ago. Heart attack. He never stopped blaming himself for not getting you out." Ethan felt something splinter inside him. Years stolen. A father he never met. A mother turned into a stranger. All because of Daniel Reed. Claire touched his arm gently. "Ethan, what are you going to do?" He looked at her, eyes dark, jaw tight. "Find him," Ethan said, "and make him tell the truth." Snow battered the windows as Ethan left the apartment. The wind felt colder now, sharper, like the whole city held its breath, because the boy who had walked in searching for answers was gone, and the man who walked out carried fire in his veins. Ethan stood at the threshold of Pastor Daniel's study, the photo of Claire burning a hole in his pocket. The door was closed, as always, the brass handle cold beneath his fingers. He knocked once, twice. No answer. "Daniel," he said through gritted teeth. "Open the door," a pause. Then the lock clicked, and the door swung inwards slowly. The room smelled of old books and candle wax. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. Pastor Daniel looked up from his Bible, expression calm, practiced. "Ethan, I was expecting you." Ethan stepped inside. "Expecting me? You've lied to me my whole life. You stole me from my real parents. I know everything now." Daniel's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Everything?" "Yes, the letters you intercepted, the files you hid. Claire, Michael Hartman, do you hear yourself? You've spent 21 years building lies around me." Daniel leaned back in his chair, hands steepled. "I hear you, but your anger, your judgment, It is clouded. You cannot see the purpose in God's plan. God's plan. Ethan laughed, bitter. You're not God. You're a fraud. You're the one who decided my life was yours to control. And for what? Power? Control over people who trusted you? Daniel's voice stayed calm, steady, but it carried that edge of authority that had mesmerized congregations for years. I raised you, protected you, guided you toward the light. You should be grateful for that, Ethan. Not consumed by resentment. Ethan's fists clenched. Protected? Is that what you call stealing a child from his mother? Destroying a family? You don't get to talk about light when you've spent decades in darkness. Daniel stood, moving toward the desk with deliberate slowness. You misunderstand, son. Everything I did was for you, to keep you safe. Claire was unstable. Michael, weak. I took responsibility. I acted as a father should. You acted as a tyrant, Ethan said, voice rising. I trusted you. I called you Dad. And it was all a lie. Do you know how that feels? Do you understand the kind of betrayal I've lived with every day? Daniel stopped by the window, looking out over the quiet city below. Betrayal is in the eye of the beholder. You see the pain. I see duty. There is a difference, one that only faith can explain. Ethan stepped closer, jaw tight, fists shaking. Faith? Faith doesn't excuse this. Nothing excuses this. All those sermons, all the Sunday prayers, the praise you soaked in. It was a mask for your lies. Daniel turned, expression cold now. You think you know the truth. You think the files you discovered tell the whole story. But life is never so simple, Ethan. The world is full of shadows. You cannot simply burn away the darkness with anger. Ethan's chest heaved. The words collided with the raw, aching rage in his veins. I don't care anymore. You've built your empire on manipulation, on secrets, and I'm done pretending. You've taken everything from me, but not tonight. Tonight, someone will pay. And it starts with you. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Do you really believe justice belongs to you? That you can decide right from wrong without consequence? You are not the judge of men, Ethan. You are a child blinded by passion. I am done being a child, Ethan said, voice low, dangerous. And you are going to see that the lies you've lived in can't protect you anymore. Not from me, not from the truth. Daniel's lips pressed together, unreadable, as if calculating his next move. His gaze flicked to the Bible on the desk, then back to Ethan. If this is truly the path you've chosen, then you will face it fully. But remember, once you cross it, there is no return. Ethan stepped back, eyes dark, jaw set. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with tension, like smoke before a fire. He turned toward the door, the photograph of Claire burning in his pocket, a promise and a threat all at once. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The city was silent, oblivious. Ethan paused, hand on the doorknob. This isn't over, Daniel, not by a long shot. And with that, he left the room. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Pastor Daniel in the dim light, silent, calculating. Ethan walked down the corridor, the first embers of what he was about to do igniting deep inside. Because some truths could not be forgiven. Some fires had to be set. The table was set, as if nothing had changed. Plates polished, silverware aligned, candles flickering gently in their holders. Sunday light streamed through the kitchen windows, though it did nothing to warm the tension in the room. Ethan sat at the head of the table, eyes scanning every detail. Margaret across from him moved with careful precision, placing napkins beside each plate, her hands trembling just slightly. Pastor Daniel entered last, towering as always, the familiar calm in his step, hiding the awareness of the storm gathering around him. Dinner's ready, Margaret said softly, voice tight, almost rehearsed. Daniel smiled, oblivious to the undercurrent. Thank you, Margaret. It smells perfect. Ethan's fingers drummed against the polished wood. He watched his father's eyes dart around the table, unknowing. For 21 years, Daniel had controlled the room, the family, the church, and Ethan had obeyed, or thought he had. Not tonight. He reached for his glass of water, hands steady, though his heart hammered. So, we're all here, he said, voice low, almost casual. Daniel looked up. Yes, family together. That's what matters, son. Ethan's jaw tightened. Family, huh? Funny how that word gets used when people keep secrets, when they lie, when they steal lives. Daniel froze, just slightly, a flicker in his expression. Margaret's hands paused over her fork. You're talking about Claire, Ethan said softly. About Michael Hartman. About everything you've hidden. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Ethan, don't, Ethan interrupted, eyes blazing. Don't try to excuse it. Don't try to twist it. This is about truth. And tonight, we all know it. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across the walls. The air felt charged, heavy, as if the silence itself were waiting for something to snap. Margaret finally spoke, voice shaking. "Ethan, please, let's not—" "No," Ethan said. He rose from his chair. The floorboards creaked beneath him, loud in the stillness. No pretending anymore. No smiles, no faith, no sermons. I've held this in for too long. Tonight, the lies end. Daniel rose as well, calm but tense, the practiced air of authority battling the uncertainty in his eyes. "Ethan, this— You don't get to speak," Ethan cut him off. His gaze flicked to his mother, then back to his father. "You built walls around your secrets, around me, around this family. I've walked inside those walls, and I've seen what's behind them. And I know what has to happen next." Margaret whispered, almost pleading. "Ethan, think about what you're saying." But Ethan didn't listen. The air around the table seemed to thrum with the energy of years of betrayal. He could feel it in his veins, in the tension coiling tight in his chest. He moved toward the door, glancing once over his shoulder. The flicker of candlelight caught in his eyes, reflecting the storm within. "We're done pretending, all of us. The truth will be laid bare tonight." Silence settled over the table like a shroud. The clink of a fork against a plate, unnoticed, echoed in the tension. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, dusting the lawn, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The warm kitchen light contrasted with the cold world outside, a perfect mirror of what Ethan carried inside him. Fire and ice, rage and sorrow, a promise of reckoning. And as he stepped out of the room, leaving his parents behind, the first threads of what he had planned for the night started to pull taut, because some truths, once uncovered, could not be ignored, and some fires once sparked could not be contained. The night was colder than Ethan expected, snow crunching beneath his boots as he moved across the yard. The house loomed behind him, warm light spilling through the windows, giving no hint of the storm gathering inside his chest. Every breath felt sharp, every heartbeat loud, echoing in his ears like a drum. He carried the gasoline can like a ritual object, the smell sharp, pungent, cutting through the cold night air. His hands shook slightly, though not from fear. Something deeper, heavier, had him in its grip. Anger, betrayal, years of stolen truths, all coiled tight inside him. Inside, the house was quiet. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. The family had gathered in the kitchen for what they believed was another normal night. Dinner plates remained uneaten, the silverware untouched. Margaret's hands were folded in her lap, calm and fearful, while Daniel read the Bible with practiced serenity. Ethan paused just beyond the threshold, listening. "You're back late," Margaret said softly. Sensing him before seeing him, Ethan didn't answer. His eyes locked on his father, who looked up, puzzled. "Ethan." Daniel's voice was steady, controlled, but something in his chest tightened. He inhaled slowly. For a moment, he considered turning back, leaving the house intact, walking away from the chaos waiting to unfold. But the weight of truth, of years of betrayal, anchored him in place. "I'm here," he said finally, "and I'm done pretending." Daniel rose immediately, the Bible dropping to the table with a hollow thud. "What do you mean?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "You've lied to me my entire life, hidden my real parents, taken me from Claire, from Michael. I've lived in your shadow, worshipping the mask you wore for the world. That ends tonight," Margaret gasped softly, moving toward him. "Ethan, please, don't." But he ignored her, moving past the kitchen, carrying the gasoline like a promise. He poured the liquid along the hallway, the slick trail reflecting the candlelight, the smell sharp and clinging. Daniel stepped forward, hand raised. "Ethan, stop!" "This isn't you. You're letting anger guide you." "I'm letting truth guide me," Ethan said, voice low, dangerous, "and the truth burns everything it touches." He paused at the doorway to the living room, the largest flame waiting in his mind's eye. He could see himself walking back into the past, every lie stacked on the shelves, every sermon, every hidden file, every stolen letter, and now it would all be ash. "Ethan, don't," Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes, reaching for him. He turned briefly, their eyes meeting. Not hatred, not spite, just grief. He almost faltered, almost stopped. But the ember inside him had become a flame, and nothing could extinguish it. With a trembling hand, he struck the match. Flame leapt to the gasoline trail, racing quickly along the wood floors. A sudden roar filled the house, crackling as the fire consumed everything in its path. Smoke swirled upward, curling around the chandelier, filling the air with heat and fury. Daniel lunged toward him, but Ethan stepped back. "Stay out of my way," he shouted. "This is the truth!" The fire spread rapidly, devouring rugs, curtains, photographs. Ethan could feel the heat on his skin, smell the thick, choking smoke, see shadows twisting in the flickering light. Margaret screamed, grabbing at him, but he pushed gently past. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He could hear the sirens now, faint but approaching. He didn't care. The world was narrowing to one thing: the fire, the fury, the truth. Ethan stepped into the hallway, flames licking the walls, consuming the history he had lived in. His father's shouts mixed with Margaret's cries, distant now, muffled by the roar of the blaze. The smell of burning wood and paper was overwhelming, clinging to his hair and clothes. He stood in the center of the inferno, silent for a long moment, watching the house crumble under the weight of its secrets. Years of lies, manipulation, and stolen moments turned to ash before his eyes. And then, with the first full scream from the living room, he turned away, walking through the snow-covered yard, the fire behind him, a roaring testament to every betrayal he had suffered. Ethan didn't look back. Not once. The house burned, and with it, the past he had carried for 21 years. And yet, even as the flames consumed everything, he knew this was only the beginning, because some truths, once revealed, demanded more than fire. Ethan stood outside the smouldering ruins of the house, the cold night air biting through his clothes. The fire had died down, leaving blackened timber and smoke rising into the dark sky. Sirens wailed in the distance, fading as firefighters assessed the aftermath. Ash settled on his shoulders like a shroud, and for the first time, he felt the weight of everything he had done. He didn't move as the neighbors whispered, their voices tentative, afraid. He didn't respond when officers approached, their faces serious. Questions forming but left unspoken as they studied him. The world had shrunk to the blackened skeleton of the house, and the truths it had finally revealed. Inside, chaos had reigned. Margaret had collapsed, tears streaking her face, clutching nothing but the remnants of a life she could no longer protect. Pastor Daniel had survived, barely, pulled from the wreckage by firefighters, coughing and scorched but alive. His eyes, once commanding, now reflected fear, disbelief, and the first flickers of remorse. Ethan watched silently as Daniel was led away, restrained by paramedics and police. The man who had controlled his childhood, his faith, his identity, now powerless, vulnerable, human. He felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness. Flashbacks ran through his mind. Claire's trembling hands, her voice cracking as she told him the truth about Michael, about Daniel, about the life he had been stolen from. Margaret's silent complicity. The subtle fear that had always lurked behind her smiles. The years of sermons, smiles, Sunday services, and locked doors. And now, all of it was gone, reduced to ash, smoke, and echoes. A hand touched his shoulder. He turned to see Claire standing there, bundled in a coat, eyes wide but steady. "You did what you had to do," she said softly. "You exposed the truth. You reclaimed it." Ethan swallowed, voice tight. "It feels empty." "It has to," Claire replied. "The truth always leaves a void. What matters is what you do next, what you build from here." He nodded, letting the photograph of her in his pocket brush against his fingers. For years, it had been a promise, a symbol of what had been taken. Now it felt like a foundation, fragile but real. Firefighters moved in the background, water hoses spraying over glowing embers, smoke curling into the air. The neighborhood had gathered at the edge of the chaos, watching the aftermath, some horrified, some in awe. The house that had been a symbol of power, of control, of deception, was no more. Ethan walked slowly toward the snow-covered street, leaving the ruins behind, each step crunched underfoot, sound echoing in the empty night. The sky was black, but the stars above glimmered faintly, cold and distant witnesses to everything that had happened. He thought of Daniel, coughing and scarred, escorted into an ambulance, no sermons left to command him. no authority left to hide behind. The man who had stolen his life now faced consequences he could not escape. Margaret sat in the distance, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the remains of her home. Ethan didn't approach her. Words would not reach her tonight. She had chosen silence for too long, and the ashes were proof. Claire fell into step beside him. They walked together, slow and deliberate, the cold air filling the spaces left by fire. No one spoke for a long while, but the silence was not empty. It was understanding, a fragile agreement forged in smoke and truth. Ethan lifted his gaze to the sky. The stars shimmered like distant embers. He let the wind whip across his face, letting the cold bite and cleanse. For the first time in years, he felt free. Not healed, not whole, but free. Because some lies could not survive. Some secrets could not remain buried. And some fires, once lit, could illuminate the darkness better than any sermon, better than any commandment, better than any mask of righteousness. The ashes told no lies, and Ethan finally believed them. He let the photograph slip from his pocket, carrying it carefully between his hands, a symbol of truth reclaimed, of life restored in fragments. Behind him, the house smoldered. In front of him, the path was clear. He took a deep breath and stepped forward into the night, carrying nothing but the truth, and the knowledge that he would never be anyone's shadow again.